So moving on from fun animations and transformations, in this final video on CSS3, we're going to see how we can use CSS3 to improve our website layouts. And the first of these that we're going to look at is a multi-column layout. Now this is actually pretty easy to set up, but before CSS3 there was no easy way to get multiple columns in your pages. You had to resort to quite complex CSS or even JavaScript solutions. So let's see how easy it is to do in CSS3. So first off, let's get a reasonably chunky amount of text in our div. I'll just put a couple of line breaks in between each paragraph. There we go. And then we'll style it in the usual way. So multi-column. And then all we need to use is column count, and then however many columns you want. So call it 3. Let's take a look. And sadly it hasn't worked. That's because this is one of the CSS3 properties that's not fully supported by Chrome yet. So to get it working in Chrome, you need to add a WebKit column count as well. And then we have a look, then that works really well. And this is just a reminder, you should always check the support of these CSS3 and HTML5 methods that you're using and put in any workaround that you'll need to make sure that they work on your users' browsers. The usual one is WebKit for anything that's WebKit based. So that's Chrome, Safari and Opera. And then if you need anything custom for Firefox, that's usually Moz, short for Mozilla. So to be sure that this was going to work in all browsers, you would add those 3 instructions. You can customize this further if you like by deciding what the column gap should be. So there's a default there of around 10 pixels. But if you want to customize that, you just use column gap and then whatever you want it to be. So maybe 40 pixels. And sadly, I'm going to have to use these as well to make sure it works in all browsers, specifically the WebKit one for Chrome here. There we go. So that's increased the column gap. We can even add and style a rule between the columns, so a line. It's a bit laborious, I'm afraid, especially because we have to do it 3 times. But we use column rule style and then one of those. So I'll go for solid. And then we need to do the same thing but with WebKit and Moz in front. In fact, I'll leave those there because we're going to be doing a few of these now. So we then need column rule width. So I'll just have 1px. And you might be able to anticipate column rule color. I'll use grey. And then let's add these 2 in to maximize our compatibility, and then we just prefix the official rule with those 2. There we go. So a bit of a hassle, but we do get a nice rule down the middle. So if you're making some kind of newspaper type website, then this will be a great way to do it. Sometimes you might want an element to span certain columns. So say you've got a header. Maybe news for nerds, something like that. So to make that header span multiple columns, we use column span. And we can either put all or none or a number if we wanted to span a certain number of columns. So I'll go for all. And for this one, we only need a WebKit alternative, Moz is fine for column span. Let's take a look. There we go. So now it's spanning all the way across, even though it doesn't actually need to. And that's about it. Notice that this is different to the media queries. Oh, that's unfortunate. That's better. So Chrome is not supporting these columns particularly well here. So these will not be responsive as such, so they'll change their width, but they won't flow one underneath the other like our Bootstrap columns do. But if that's the behavior that you want, then column count it is. Alright, so that's enough about columns. I mentioned earlier that we can use CSS3 to calculate values for us. And doing that is actually pretty straightforward. You may remember that when we built the code player way back in the jQuery section, we wanted to have a heading. So we could even use the new header tag. And then a div underneath that, which was the height of the screen minus the height of the heading. And we had to use some jQuery to do that, but we could have done it using CSS3. So let's see how that would work. We'll start off by styling the header. So this is just going to be a width 100%, height 50 pixels, and we'll add a background color of grey. There we go. So that's where our heading might be. And while we're here, I'll just set the margin to 0 so that that goes all the way to the edge. There we go. Now then, if I want my container div to be the whole height of the page minus the 50 pixels from the top, I can do that really easily. So we use container, and again we'll set the width to 100%. We'll give it a background color of yellow, and then we would set the height to calc, and then 100% minus 50 pixels. And that will do exactly what you might think. It'll set it to 100% of the height of the screen minus 50 pixels. Now that's the basics of it, but we do need a couple more options to make it work. First off, to get this 100% to work, we need to set the position to absolute. And we also need to add a WebKit prefix to the height as well, so that everything works in Chrome. Let's take a look. There we go. So now the height of the screen is the height of our page, but we haven't had to use any JavaScript to work out what that is. And you can use any kind of calculation here. So you can multiply, plus, subtract, divide, etc. So that definitely makes your life much easier when you find yourself using JavaScript for styling. Alright, so just a couple more things left. First, I would like to show you the Flexbox, which is a great way of aligning things while avoiding floats, which can get quite nasty at times. So the normal way to create a Flexbox would be something like create a class of Flexbox container, and then within your Flexbox container you might have some more divs with a class of Flexbox item or something like that. I'm just going to put a few items in there. There we go. And then we'd style those. Most importantly, with a display of flex, and also a display of WebKit flex. We don't need a Moz one here. And then you might want to set a width and a height And I'll just set a background color here as well so we can see what's going on. Let's have aqua. So as it is, that doesn't change much compared to just a normal Flexbox. We can use the settings we saw earlier to center things horizontally and vertically, which is a nice extra feature. Vertical centering in particular can be tricky without a Flexbox. But more importantly, we can use Flexbox item, and we might want to give that a background color of bisque. Why not? And let's give it a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels as well. And you can see that these are already floating to the left of each other. Make it a little bit clearer if we give them a margin. So say 10 pixels. And then if we added more of those, then they actually start to behave like columns and they get thinner and thinner without going on to the next line. So compared to floating, where we're not necessarily sure whether one element is going to go on to the next line or not because we don't know the screen size, the Flexbox is much more predictable for us. So if we change the width here to 100%, then it will stretch them out to a maximum size of their full size, but it will compress them if the page is narrower as well. Now within that we can do some pretty fancy things. So let's just add some numbers to these. So we can see which one's which. And then in our Flexbox container, if we want to, we can set the flex direction to be row reverse. And we need to do the same thing as well with a WebKit in front of it, and that will essentially lay them out from right to left. We can also use a flex direction of column. Like that, and that will lay them out in a column fashion. And it will try and squeeze them in vertically if it can. If I change the container height to say 500, then it will stretch them out a bit more. And we can use column reverse if we want to as well to go upwards. So the whole idea here is to get a consistent layout. Now that might not be what you're after. If you're after a responsive website, you might want a different layout for different screen sizes. But if you want to be pretty sure that your layout is going to be the same, then Flexbox is a great way to do it. If you really want your Flexbox items to wrap, we can achieve that as well using Flex Wrap. And we've got wrap, no wrap, and wrap reverse. I'm going to go for wrap, and we'll add a WebKit Flex Wrap as well. And then if they haven't got enough room, they'll wrap around more like floated items. Alright, so enough about Flexbox, onto our final bit of CSS3, and this is a small but very welcome introduction, and this is box sizing. And to remind you about the issue with box sizing, I'm going to give item 2 a cheeky bit of inline styling, where I'm going to give it a border of 5px solid grey. And that will then, as well as giving it the border, it will make it bigger than the rest, because you'll remember from the CSS section that this width doesn't include the width of the border, which in my experience is not normally the behavior that you want. But we can fix that with one line of CSS3, and that's using box sizing, and then we can specify border box, content box, or padding box, and I'm going to go for border box, and that will then include the border in the total size, which will mean that item 2 is now the same size as everything else, even though it's got a border. And that even includes any padding. So if I put padding of 10 pixels in there, it doesn't increase the size of the box, because the size of the box is inclusive of both the border and the padding. And when I discovered that, I breathed a big sigh of relief because it does make things a lot easier when you're styling things that have varying borders and paddings. So that takes us to the end of our journey through HTML5 and CSS3. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've had a lot of ideas about how you could use some of these features in your websites. A reminder again to make sure to check the availability of the various fancy new features that you're using in the user's browsers, and where necessary to include the WebKit and Moz prefixes to make sure that you get the desired effect in every browser in which it's available. It's now time to introduce our final language of the course. It's one of my favourite programming languages and a great one for new coders to learn, and that's Python.